If you have lived in Kentucky long enough, there is a good chance you have driven past places where entire communities once stood without slowing down once. A field with no explanation. A cemetery with no town around it. A single brick wall standing in the middle of nowhere with trees growing through the windows. Kentucky has more of these places than most people realize, and the stories behind them are stranger than anything you would find in a history textbook. Ghost towns in Kentucky are genuinely underrated, not just as places, but as stories. Because the reasons these towns disappeared are not always floods and railroads and economic decline. Sometimes they are weirder than that. Sometimes they are darker. Sometimes they are the kind of thing that makes you pull over and just stand there for a minute, trying to process what happened on the ground beneath your feet. These are 12 of the weirdest ghost towns in Kentucky. And number 1 is the one that stays with you. Number 12, Mineral Mound, Kentucky. Mineral Mound sits in Livingston County on a bluff above the Cumberland River, and it disappeared for a reason that almost no other town in Kentucky can claim. It was destroyed not by water or economics or a railroad decision, but by the specific combination of extreme geographic isolation and a medical crisis that the community had no infrastructure to survive. In the mid-19th century, Mineral Mound had genuine promise: a landing on the Cumberland, a small but functioning commercial base, and the kind of early momentum that made settlers believe they were building something permanent. Then disease moved through the hollow. Cholera and malaria hit river communities throughout western Kentucky during the mid-19th century with a consistency that made living near the water a genuine gamble. And Mineral Mound was isolated enough that when illness came through, it had no medical support within reasonable reach. The families who could leave did. The ones who stayed faced subsequent outbreaks with a community that was already smaller and more fragile than it had been before. What remained after the cycle of illness and departure ran its course was too small to sustain itself commercially. The landing fell quiet. The bluff above the Cumberland went back to being a bluff. The weirdness of Mineral Mound is in how completely a medical crisis erased something that geography had positioned so well. Number 11, Leatherwood, Kentucky. Perry County in eastern Kentucky produced one of the strangest ghost town stories in the entire state, and it begins not with economics or geography, but with a man who declared himself God. In the 1870s, a preacher named John Hansel began attracting followers along Leatherwood Creek in the remote mountains of Perry County. His claim started as religious authority and escalated over time into a full assertion of literal divinity. He told his followers he was God on earth. A significant number of them believed him. The community that formed around Hansel organized itself entirely around his spiritual authority, rather than around any economic or geographic logic. People relocated to be near him. They restructured their lives around his demands. They gave him money and obedience, and the kind of total trust that a genuinely isolated mountain community in the 1870s could produce when a sufficiently charismatic personality applied sufficient pressure. When the claims collapsed, as they inevitably did under the weight of promises that reality could not honor, there was nothing underneath the community to hold it together. The hollow was just a hollow. The creek was just a creek. The people dispersed back into the mountains and left almost nothing behind except a story so strange that even the people who lived closest to it struggled to explain it afterward. Number 10, Columbus, Kentucky. Columbus sits on a bluff above the Mississippi River in Hickman County, and it was once called the Gibraltar of the West, not as a compliment to its scenery, but as a military assessment of its strategic value. During the Civil War, Confederate forces fortified Columbus so heavily that they stretched a 65-ton iron chain across the Mississippi River to stop Union gunboats from passing. The bluff above the river held artillery positions that commanders on both sides considered among the most formidable defensive works in the Western theater. Ulysses Grant eventually made the Columbus position strategically untenable, and Confederate forces evacuated, but not before the town had been transformed into something unrecognizable from the civilian community it had been before the war. What finished Columbus permanently was not the fighting, but the river itself. The Mississippi shifted its course in the decades after the war, eroding the famous bluff and taking with it the commercial geography that had made the location seem so valuable. A town that had been called the Gibraltar of the West watched the river eat the ground it was standing on. Columbus today has a few hundred residents and a state park where the chain once crossed. The chain is still there. The town that defended it is essentially gone. Number 9. Blandville, Kentucky. Blandville was the county seat of Ballard County for several decades in the 19th century, and the story of what happened to it is one of the more quietly devastating in the state. County seat status in 19th century Kentucky was not ceremonial. It was the organizing principle of a community's entire existence. The courthouse brought lawyers and judges and litigants and merchants and the full supporting economy of an administrative center. The courthouse was the reason most of the commercial activity was happening in that particular spot, rather than somewhere else. When the county seat moved to Wickliffe in 1880, Blandville lost that function overnight. And here is the weird part: nothing else changed. The geography was the same. The land was the same. The people who had been living there were still there. But without the administrative anchor, the commercial logic of the community simply dissolved. Businesses relocated to follow the courthouse. Families followed the businesses. The physical structures of Blandville stood empty, and then deteriorated, and then disappeared, until almost nothing remained to mark a place that had been a functioning county seat within living memory. Blandville is one of the weirdest Kentucky ghost towns precisely because it did not burn down or flood or get bypassed by a railroad. It simply lost its reason and then ceased to exist. Number 8. Wazioto, Kentucky. Wazioto is one of the oldest place names in Kentucky, and it belongs to a community that existed in Bell County long before European settlers arrived and continued to exist in various forms well into the 19th century. The name itself is a Cherokee word, which tells you something about the depth of the history embedded in this particular stretch of the Cumberland Gap corridor. Indigenous communities knew this location as a significant waypoint along migration and trading routes that predated the United States by centuries. The European settlement that built up around Wazioto in the early 19th century used the same geographic advantage that had made the location significant to indigenous communities. The corridor through the mountains, the access to the river, the natural gathering point that the terrain created. What the European settlement added was a commercial infrastructure that depended entirely on those geographic advantages remaining economically relevant. When the railroad came through the region and reorganized the commercial geography of Bell County, Wazioto found itself on the wrong side of the new arrangement. The town that had been a significant waypoint for centuries became irrelevant in the span of a decade. The layers of history embedded in that location, indigenous, colonial, early American, are all equally invisible today. Number 7. Proctor, Kentucky. Proctor and Lee County sits in a stretch of the Kentucky River Valley that was already remote before the Army Corps of Engineers made it significantly weirder. This was a functioning river community with a ferry crossing, a commercial base tied to the timber trade moving down the Kentucky River, and the kind of organic social organization that remote Appalachian communities developed when geography forced self-sufficiency. Proctor was not a large town, but it was a real one, with genuine community infrastructure and people who had built their lives around a specific place. What happened to Proctor involves a dam that was proposed, partially built, fought over for decades, partially dismantled, and never completed, leaving the community in a state of suspended uncertainty that lasted long enough to drain it of the population and investment that might have sustained it. The Beattyville Pool project promised to flood the valley, and displaced residents were told to leave and compensated accordingly. Many did leave. Then the project stalled. Then it was canceled. The people who had left did not come back. The community that had been told its land would be underwater found itself in the position of watching its town empty out for a flood that never came. Proctor today has a handful of residents and the specific quality of a place that was given up on before it needed to be. Number 6. Mouth of Seneca, Kentucky. There is a community in Owsley County that is not a ghost town in the way most ghost towns are. You cannot visit the site, you cannot walk the streets or look at the foundations or read a historical marker at the edge of a field. The town is underwater. It has been underwater since 1960, when the Army Corps of Engineers completed Buckhorn Dam on the Middle Fork of the Kentucky River, and the rising water of Buckhorn Lake covered everything in the valley that the dam created. The families who had farmed that valley for generations were given notice and compensation and told to relocate. They watched the water come up over weeks. First the lowest fields, then the gardens along the riverbank, Then the porches of the houses they had already moved out of but could not stop watching. The church steeples were the last things visible above the surface before the lake covered them completely. The cemeteries were relocated to higher ground before the flooding. The government moved the graves as part of the project, but the roads and the foundations and the stone walls and everything else that the community had built over generations went under and stayed there. In dry years, when the lake level drops, things emerge near the shoreline: fence posts, foundation stones, the outline of a road visible in the exposed mud at the water's edge. People in Owsley County whose grandparents told them about standing on the hillside watching the water rise still know the names of the roads and the neighbors and the churchyard that has been 60 feet underwater for over 60 years. Buckhorn Lake is a recreational destination. Weekend boaters have no idea what is underneath them. Number 5. Tolu, Kentucky. Crittenden County in western Kentucky is not where most people look for weird history, and that is exactly the problem. Tolu sat on the Cumberland River with a commercial identity so specific that the town was actually named for it. Tolu balsam, a medicinal resin extracted from local trees that was valuable enough throughout the 19th century to give this small river landing a degree of economic distinctiveness that most comparable communities never achieved. The combination of river commerce and a specific extractable product made Tolu more substantial than its size suggested. It had real infrastructure, a real commercial identity, and the kind of specificity that made it different from the dozens of other small Cumberland River landings that existed and disappeared during the same period. When the steamboat era ended and the balsam trade declined, and the railroad bypassed the river settlements in favor of inland routes, Tolu lost its commercial foundation and its specific identity simultaneously. A town that had been named for something real became a name that most Kentuckians have never heard attached to a place that barely registers on current maps. The Cumberland still runs through. The balsam trees are gone, and so is everything that depended on them. Number 4. Williamsburg Landing, Kentucky. The Cumberland River shaped southeastern Kentucky in ways that the landscape still shows if you know how to read it, and Williamsburg Landing in Whitley County is one of the clearest examples of what happened to communities that built their entire existence around the timber trade moving out of the Appalachian Mountains. This was a collection and transfer point where the commerce of the hills met the commerce of the river, logs coming down out of the hollows being gathered and processed, and loaded onto vessels heading south toward markets that the mountain communities supplying them would never see. The logging era ended the way extraction eras always end in Kentucky, when the accessible resource was gone, and the economic case for maintaining the infrastructure that served it collapsed along with it. The landing lost its commercial purpose with a speed that the community had no way to absorb. There was no alternative economic base, no secondary industry, no geographic advantage that survived the end of the timber trade. What replaced the activity of the landing was silence, and then vegetation, and then the particular invisibility that the Kentucky landscape produces when it reclaims something. Williamsburg Landing is weird because it was so completely functional and then so completely gone with almost nothing in between. Number 3. Franklinville, Kentucky. Franklinville in Simpson County is one of the weirdest ghost towns in Kentucky for a reason that sounds mundane until you think about it carefully. It did not flood. It did not burn. It was not built on a resource that ran out. It was not declared God's kingdom by a charismatic preacher. It simply lost a competition it did not know it was in. And the competition it lost was decided by a railroad company in an office somewhere making a routing decision that Franklinville had no input into and no ability to appeal. The town was platted with genuine ambition and settled with real conviction. It had a post office, commercial businesses, and the early social infrastructure that Kentucky settlements built quickly when founding energy was high. The people who built it believed they were building something that would grow. The railroad came through Simpson County and chose Franklin instead of Franklinville, and that was the end of it. Franklin became the county seat. Franklin got the growth. Franklinville got bypassed and then quietly emptied as its residents made the rational calculation that their futures were elsewhere. The weird part is how complete the erasure was. A community with real founding energy and real ambition was ended not by disaster or disease or divine proclamation, but by a routing decision made by people who probably never visited it. The land it stood on is ordinary farmland now. Number 2. Warwick, Kentucky. Warwick was a river town in Breckinridge County that operated at a level of regional importance that its current total invisibility makes almost impossible to believe. It had a courthouse, a functioning commercial waterfront on the Ohio River, a ferry crossing that made it a regular stop for travelers, and the legal infrastructure of a community that considered itself permanent. The courthouse in particular gave Warwick the kind of administrative weight that signaled permanence. Courts do not set up in places that are not expected to last. The Ohio River did not share that expectation. It flooded Warwick repeatedly and with increasing severity across the decades of the 19th century. Each flood left the town slightly smaller and slightly less willing to rebuild at full scale. The courthouse lost its function when administrative reorganization moved county governance elsewhere. The ferry crossing became less relevant as other crossing points developed. The commercial waterfront that had given the town its economic identity lost traffic to communities better positioned for the changing patterns of river commerce. Warwick did not end dramatically. It ended the way a lot of Kentucky towns ended, incrementally, one departure at a time, each loss making the next one more likely, until the community reached a threshold below which it could not sustain itself and simply stopped being a community. What is weird about Warwick is the courthouse. A functioning court was the most serious institutional investment a 19th century Kentucky community could make. Warwick had one, and it still disappeared so completely that almost no physical evidence of it remains anywhere on the Ohio River bank where it once stood. Number 1. New Haven Colony, Kentucky. In Nelson County, Kentucky, in the early 19th century, a group of settlers arrived with a specific and extraordinary ambition: to build a utopian community organized around religious principles strict enough to govern every aspect of daily life. The community they established operated under communal ownership of property, strict behavioral codes enforced by community governance, and the specific intensity of a settlement that believed it was doing something that had never been done correctly before. Members gave their resources to the collective. Individual economic independence was surrendered in favor of community organization. The experiment attracted believers who relocated from considerable distances to participate in what was being described as a genuinely new way of living. The problem with utopian communities in early Kentucky is the same problem utopian communities have always had everywhere: the gap between the vision and the reality of living inside it. The behavioral codes that seemed righteous in principle became oppressive in practice. Members who had surrendered their individual resources found that leaving the community meant leaving with nothing. The leadership structure that the community's founding principles had concentrated in specific individuals became a mechanism of control that had no external check. Disputes that in an ordinary community would be resolved through ordinary social negotiation became existential crises in a settlement where everything was shared and nothing was private. The community fractured. The fracturing was bitter because everything was at stake: property, relationships, the entire social world that members had built inside the settlement. People who left took the community's coherence with them. People who stayed found themselves in a diminished version of the experiment they had signed up for. The physical settlement that had been built with collective labor during the founding period stood for a time after the community that had built it dissolved. But without the organizational energy that had constructed it, the structures deteriorated and the land reverted to ordinary Kentucky farmland. What makes New Haven Colony the weirdest ghost town in Kentucky is not just what happened there. Utopian communities failed throughout early America, and the pattern was not unique to Kentucky. What makes it weird is the specific human cost of a failure that was built into the design from the beginning. The people who came to Nelson County believing they were building something perfect gave up individual security for collective promise, and lost both when the promise could not be kept. The land where they built it shows nothing of what happened there. There is no marker. There is no preserved structure. There is no entry in most Kentucky history references. There is just a field in Nelson County where people once tried to build something they believed in completely, and failed in ways they could not have predicted when they arrived. Kentucky is full of places like that. Subscribe if you enjoyed, and leave a comment of what place to do next.